He slammed the door before Temperance, Calloway had finished asking. She stood on the porch of the ranch house nearest North Rim, with the storm driving sleet sideways into her collar, her satchel soaked through. Her feet past feeling inside boots that had walked 11 miles that day alone. And she stared at the plank door that had just shut in her face with a finality that rattled the frame. "Please," she said again to the door, because there was no one left to say it to. "I only need a corner of the barn. I'll be gone by first light." Nothing answered but the wind. She had heard, before she'd even reached the porch, the low warning growl of a dog somewhere behind the house, and had seen, in the lamplit gap before the door swung to, a man's face hard-set, unshaven, eyes gone flat and closed the moment he'd taken in a strange woman alone at his door in a blizzard. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked why she was walking the North Rim road alone in a storm with nothing but a satchel and the clothes on her back. He'd looked at her exactly long enough to decide she was trouble, and shut the door on the deciding. Temperance was not, by nature, a woman given to tears, but she stood a long moment on that porch with the cold working its way past shivering and into something more dangerous, something heavy and slow, and felt the closest she had come in a hard year to giving up entirely. She had left her uncle's house in Cutbank 6 days before, with nothing more than what she could carry, rather than marry Silas Krebs, a coarse, calculating creditor twice her age who had bought up the last of her late father's debts, and meant to collect the remainder in the shape of a bride, with her Uncle Cyrus's full and eager blessing, since it cleared his own books besides. She could still see, too clearly for comfort, the parlor in Cutbank where the arrangement had been laid before her like a business ledger, balanced to the penny her Uncle Cyrus at his desk, not troubling even to rise, and Silas Krebs standing by the cold hearth, turning his hat in his hands with the satisfied patience of a man who had never once been told no, and did not expect to hear it now. "Your father's debts don't simply vanish because the man himself did," Cyrus had said, not unkindly, which had somehow been worse than cruelty plainly stated. "Mr. Krebs is willing to consider the whole account settled, principal and interest both, in exchange for your hand. It's a generous offer, Temperance, considering what little else you bring to a marriage." "I bring myself," she had said. "That is not a ledger entry, Uncle. I won't be paid out like one." "You'll be paid out somehow," Krebs had said, mild and certain. "One way or another, my dear. Better a husband's roof than a debtor's fate." She had said nothing further that evening, only nodded as though considering it, and packed her satchel by candlelight once the house had gone quiet, and walked out the kitchen door before dawn with what coin she could scrape together, and her mother's small folding knife for company. She had run rather than be sold off to settle a dead man's accounts, and she had walked and ridden and walked again toward the one address she still possessed in the world. A cousin of her mother's, said to live somewhere past North Rim, only to have the storm catch her 2 days short of anywhere, and this ranch house be the only shelter for 5 miles in any direction. She turned from the door at last, because there was nothing else to do, and made her way half-blind through the driving snow toward a smaller house she'd passed a 1/4 mile back, its window showing one steady square of lamplight through the storm like a held promise. The door there opened before she'd finished knocking, pulled back by a broad, weathered woman in a nightgown and shawl who took one look at Temperance, soaked, swaying, blue-lipped, and did not ask a single question before hauling her inside by the arm. "Lord in heaven, girl, get in here before you drop." The woman had her by the fire within a minute, a quilt around her shoulders within 2, and a cup of something hot and strong in her hands within 5. "I'm Hetty Voss. What in creation were you doing walking the Rim Road in this?" I knocked at the ranch house back yonder first, Temperance managed, through chattering teeth. He shut the door on me. Hetty's mouth went thin and knowing. Ledger Poe. You know him. Whole county knows him. Wasn't always so hard a man, but he's had his reasons, and he's let them curdle him past what's decent. Hetty tucked the quilt tighter. Well, you found a door that opens instead, and you'll stay behind it till this storm blows itself out and a good deal longer if you've nowhere better to be. I could use the help, and I don't imagine you've got much choice besides. I don't, Temperance admitted, and let herself, for the first time in 6 days, simply be grateful rather than merely enduring. She stayed on with Hetty Voss through that week and the next, earning her keep at mending and cooking, and the small, exacting work of a household run by a widow alone. And she told herself she had no cause to think again of the man who'd shut his door on her, hard-faced and unmoved by a stranger freezing on his porch. She told herself that, and mostly believed it except in the quiet hours before sleep, when she found herself turning over the brief glimpse of his face in the lamp gap. Not merely hard, she thought, remembering it honestly. Something under the hardness that had looked, for half a second before the door shut, almost afraid. Don't waste pity on Ledger Poe, Hetty told her, catching the direction of her silence one evening over the mending. Man had a bride once, Marguerite, her name was, come out from St. Louis full of promises, and she took up with a drifter not 4 months into the marriage, and rode off with half his savings and every soft thing left in him. He's been closing doors on strangers ever since, women especially, and I can't say I blame the impulse even while I curse the man for aiming it at a half-frozen girl who'd done him no wrong. I don't pity him, Temperance said, which was not entirely true, and Hetty's raised eyebrow said she knew it. The days settled into a rhythm that Temperance had not known she was starving for, until she had it rising before light to help with the milking, mending Hetty's threadbare linens with a needle steadier than her circumstances had any right to leave it, learning the particular gossip and geography of a county that was, in its way, kinder than Cutbank had ever troubled to be. Whatever Mrs. Voss's neighbors made of the strange girl who'd shown up half-frozen in a blizzard with no family to claim her. Some of the town's women eyed her sideways at the mercantile, the way small towns always eyed a stranger with no clear place in the ledger of who belonged to whom. And one, a sharp-tongued rancher's wife named Odile Fenwick, asked, pointedly, within Temperance's hearing, whether it was true Ledger Poe had turned her off his porch like a stray dog, and whether she meant to make trouble of it. I mean to make nothing of it, Temperance told her, evenly, beyond noting that a man's manners are his own business, and mine are mine, and I've found both around here to be a good deal more mixed than the county gossip would have a body believe. Odile had sniffed and moved off, and Hetty, watching from the counter, had laughed outright once she was gone. You've a spine on you, Hetty said. I like that in a woman. Ledger Poe could stand to catch a little of it, hard as he's gone. Temperance saw him twice more before the second storm, at a distance both times. Once riding the fence line with his foreman, once at the mercantile itself, where he'd come in for supplies, and gone still a moment at the sight of her across the room, before ducking his head and finishing his business without a word passed between them. She told herself she felt nothing at the sight of him beyond the ordinary discomfort of an unpaid debt of civility, and mostly believed it, except that she found herself, unbidden, cataloging the tired set of his shoulders, and wondering what exactly had hollowed a man out so thoroughly that he'd rather freeze a stranger on his porch than risk being wronged again. The storm that had driven Temperance to Hetty's door was nothing, it turned out, beside the one that came a week later, a screaming, day-long blizzard that buried the fence lines and turned the rim road to a trackless white nothing. And it was in the deep gray hour before that second storm broke full that word came running down from the Poe ranch, carried by a boy sent from Ledger's own foreman, half frantic and half frozen himself. Mr. Poe rode out yesterday evening after a dozen head that wandered past the north fence, the boy gasped out, at Hetty's kitchen table, before the worst of the weather came down. He never came back. Galt and the other hands went out after him at first light, soon as they could see to ride, but the storm's turned so thick they've had to turn back twice already. And Galt says, the boy's voice cracked, Galt says if Mr. Poe's pinned somewhere out on the North Range, hurt and can't move, he won't see another sunrise, not in this cold, not without somebody finding him quick. Hetty's face had gone gray. There's not a man in this county fool enough to ride out in that storm and hope to find anything, let alone one man in 1,000 acres of white. Temperance was already reaching for her coat. "Girl, you cannot mean it," Hetty said, catching her arm. "You don't know that land. You don't know where he'd have gone or where he'd have come to grief, and a woman alone lost in that storm besides the man you're hunting for is 2 deaths instead of 1. I walked past the edge of his range the night I came here," Temperance said, working the buttons of her coat with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, though not from cold this time. "I remember the shape of the ridge north of his house, the line of the fence, the draw that cuts down toward the creek. I walked half of it in the dark looking for shelter, and fear teaches a body to remember ground fast. I won't say I know it the way his own hands do, but I know it better than nothing, and nothing is what the storms left him if somebody doesn't try." "He shut the door on you," Hetty said, quiet now, searching her face. "Man near let you freeze on his own porch a week back. You don't owe him this." "I don't," Temperance agreed. "I'm not doing it because I owe him anything. I'm doing it because there's a man dying out there in the snow, and I'm the only one in this house with any notion at all of where to start looking, and I couldn't live with myself warm by this fire if I didn't at least try, whatever kind of door he once shut on me." She pulled her hood up, took the lantern Hetty thrust into her hands despite herself, and a coil of rope besides, and old Hetty's own sturdy mare from the lean-to. The boy who'd brought the news rode with her as far as the Poe ranch yard, where Galt himself met her, half frozen from his own last failed run at the storm, disbelief plain on his weathered face, at the sight of a slight, unfamiliar woman, proposing to ride out where 3 grown, range-hardened men had already turned back twice. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't a fit errand for," he stopped himself, seeming to hear how it would sound finished, and tried again. "The storms near whited out the whole North Range. Men who have worked this ground 20 years couldn't hold a line in it past the first quarter mile. I won't have another soul lost out there tonight on my account." "Then don't lose me," Temperance said. "Point me toward the last place your men saw fresh sign of him, and I'll do the rest myself. I'm not asking your leave, Mr. Galt, only your knowledge of the ground, because that's the one thing I haven't got and can't do without." Galt studied her a long moment, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of hands that were, in fact, shaking with cold and not with fear. And whatever he saw there seemed to settle something in him, because he gave her the last known bearing, and the shape of the ridge beyond the north fence, and did not try to stop her again, only pressed a second lantern and a heavier coil of line into her hands before she rode out into the white before he could think better of letting her. The storm took the world down to nothing past 10 feet in every direction, a screaming gray-white blindness that swallowed the fence line the moment she passed it, and Temperance rode north by feel and memory, and a stubbornness that had carried her the 11 miles from Cutbank a fortnight before, calling Ledger Poe's name into wind that tore the sound away before it had traveled a body's length. She found the ridge she remembered, though the storm had scoured it near unrecognizable, drifts piled where open ground had been, and the fence line itself buried past its second rail. And more than once she lost her bearing entirely and had to stop, force her breathing steady, and work backward through what she remembered of that first desperate night. The angle of the wind off the rimrock, the particular lean of a lightning-split pine, the sound the creek made where it narrowed, until the ground gave up its shape to her again. Twice, she nearly turned back herself, certain she'd ridden past whatever she was meant to find, certain the storm would claim her as easily as it seemed intent on claiming him. Both times she thought of the door shutting in her face, not with anger now, but with something stranger, a stubborn refusal to let that be the last thing that passed between them, whatever else came of the night. Near an hour into a ride that felt already like a lifetime, she found his horse first riderless, trembling, tangled by its own reins in a stand of frozen brush at the mouth of a shallow ravine, favoring one leg and clearly thrown some ways back. She freed it, looped its lead to her saddle, and pressed on along the ravine's edge on foot now, the lantern held low, calling until her voice gave out and her throat burned with the cold air dragged into it. She found him beneath an overhang of rock a quarter-mile further on, half buried already in drifted snow. His leg bent wrong beneath him, where the fall had broken it. His face gone the terrible waxen gray-blue of a man whose body had stopped fighting the cold and begun, instead, to surrender to it. Mr. Poe. She was on her knees in the snow beside him, tearing at the drift with bare hands before she'd finished deciding to. "Ledger, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, slow and unfocused, and something moved behind them that might have been recognition or might only have been the last flicker of a dying fire. "Go on," he managed, the words slurred and thick. "Go home. No sense both of us." "I didn't come out in this to be told to go home," Temperance said, already working the buttons of her own coat loose to lay it, still warm from her body, over his chest. "You shut a door on me once already, Mr. Poe. I don't intend to let you shut this one too." She worked with a speed born of a terror she did not let herself feel, until much later gathered what dead brush the overhang had kept from the worst of the snow, struck flame from the tin of matches Hetty had thrust into her coat pocket, without a word of explanation needed, and built a fire close enough to his body to draw heat, without courting the very real danger of setting the brush beneath him alight. She packed snow, oddly, around the outer edge of the small shelter to break the worst of the wind, the way her mother had once told her drovers did in a pinch, and she talked to him the entire while, not because she expected an answer, but because Hetty had told her once that a body clinging to consciousness needed something to cling to besides the cold, and her voice was the only rope she had to offer him. "You're going to be angry with me for this," she told him, splinting his broken leg with 2 branches and a strip torn from her own petticoat, working fast and sure with hands gone nearly as numb as his. "For finding you like this, weak and half frozen, and needing a woman you turned off your own porch to save your fool life. I don't much care. You can be as angry as you like once you're warm enough to manage it." Something that might have been the ghost of a laugh moved through him, more breath than sound. It took the better part of 2 hours, building the fire enough to bring feeling back partway into his hands and face, then breaking it down and half dragging, half carrying him with the aid of the horses and the rope, lashed into a crude sled of broken branches and her own coil of line, back along the ravine and up over the ridge toward the lights of his own ranch house, fighting a wind that seemed determined, at every step, to convince her to lie down in the snow herself and rest. She did not rest. She thought, more than once, of Cyrus Bell and Selah's Krebs and the marriage she'd fled rather than endure, and found, with some surprise, that the memory of that old fear steadied her rather than weakened her, because she had already proven to herself once that she could walk through a night that wanted to break her and come out the other side unbroken. Galt and the ranch hands met them a half-mile out, having turned back a third time and found, to their considerable shock, a woman half-frozen herself leading 2 horses and a makeshift sled bearing their employer, alive. "Ma'am," Galt said, staring at her as though she descended from someplace unlikely, "I don't know who you are, but I've got no words for what you just did." "Get him inside and warm," Temperance said, her own voice gone hoarse and distant with exhaustion. "The words can wait." Hetty arrived within the hour, roused from her own bed by the same boy who'd first brought the news, and found Temperance standing at the wash basin, scrubbing the last of the ravine's mud from hands that had gone raw and cracked from cold and rope both, her legs barely holding her upright. "You fool, wonderful girl," Hetty said, and gathered her into an embrace that Temperance, worn past the point of resistance, simply allowed, some old and guarded part of herself loosening at last in the older woman's arms. "I near didn't let you go. I'll not soon forgive myself for how close I came to stopping you." "You'd have been right to try," Temperance said, into her shoulder. "It was a fool's errand by any sensible measure. I just couldn't make myself count it that way, not with a man dying for the lack of someone willing to look." "That's not foolishness," Hetty said, pulling back to look at her, fierce and proud. "That's the rarest kind of courage there is, the kind that doesn't wait to be asked." He was 3 days coming back to himself properly, fevered and drifting in the aftermath of the exposure, and Temperance stayed the whole of it, Hetty's doing as much as her own, the older woman arriving the second morning with a basket of remedies, and the flat statement that a body who'd near killed herself, dragging a man out of a blizzard, had earned the right to see him well again before she left his house. Temperance nursed him through the worst of the fever with the same steady, unhurried competence she'd shown in the snow, cooling his brow with melted snowmelt when the fever spiked, working warmth back into fingers that had gone alarmingly white at the tips, refusing Galt's offer to send for the county doctor on the grounds that the roads were still impassable, and she tended worse with less, growing up on a failing homestead where doctors were a luxury nobody's ledger allowed. On the 4th morning, Ledger Poe woke clear-eyed for the first time, and found her asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in the same dress she'd worn into the storm, her hands raw and reddened where the cold and the rope had marked them. "You're the one," he said when she woke to find him watching her, his voice rough but steady now. "From the porch, the storm before this one." "I am. I shut the door on you." "You did." He was quiet a long moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't yet read, before he said, low, "I've spent 2 years telling myself I'd never again let a stranger past my door, on account of what one cost me once. I built that door shut so careful I forgot there was a difference between keeping out the woman who ruined me and keeping out every soul the cold ever drove to my porch. You near died proving me a fool for it." She did not answer that at once, only rose to fetch him water and check the dressing on his leg, giving them both a moment to settle before either said something they weren't yet ready to mean fully. Over the days that followed, as his fever broke and his strength crept slowly back, they fell into a habit of talk that neither had expected to want Ledger asking, haltingly at first, and then with real curiosity, about the homestead she'd grown up on before her father's store failed, about the mother who'd taught her to set a bone and read a fever by the color of a man's lips. Temperance asking, in turn, about the ranch he'd built up from nothing after his own father's death, about the years before Marguerite, when he'd been, by Galt's own grudging account, an easier man to love. "Galt says you used to sing," Temperance told him one evening, mending by the fire while he worked at eating a bowl of Hetty's broth left-handed, his splinted leg propped stiff before him. driving cattle. Says you had a voice on you that could quiet a nervous herd faster than any hand in the county. Galt talks too much, Ledger said, though the corner of his mouth had moved unmistakably toward a smile. I'd like to hear it sometime. The singing, not Galt's talking. Maybe you will, he said. Once I'm a man who remembers how, and not just one who remembers how to shut doors. And though he said it lightly, she heard beneath it the real question he was asking, whether she meant to stay long enough to find out, and found that she wanted, with a fierceness that surprised her, to answer it plainly. Galt, for his part, had taken to seeking her out with small excuses, a question about the household accounts, an opinion wanted on a hand's wages. That were transparently pretexts for simply being in the same room as the woman who'd hauled his employer out of a blizzard. And by the second week, he'd stopped bothering to disguise his opinion of her at all. Whatever he says to you, or doesn't, Galt told her once gruffly, catching her alone at the woodpile, I want you to know there's not a man on this ranch who doesn't owe you a debt he can't rightly repay. Man like Ledger Poe doesn't let many people close enough to matter. You're already closer than most, whether he said so plain yet or not. I didn't near die, Temperance said, though her raw hands and the ache in every joint argued otherwise. I was cold and tired and frightened the whole ride, if you want the truth of it. But I wasn't going to let a man freeze to death in the snow for the crime of having a hard heart, Mr. Poe. That's not justice. That's just cruelty answering cruelty, and I've had enough of cruelty in my own life not to want to add to the world's store of it. Whose cruelty? He asked. Put those thoughts so ready in your mouth. She told him, then Cutbank, her father's failed store and the debts he'd left behind him, her Uncle Cyrus's cold arithmetic, Sela's Krebs and the marriage arranged over her head like a ledger being balanced, and the 6 days walking that had brought her, half frozen, to his door in the first storm. Ledger Poe listened without once interrupting, his jaw set hard by the story's end, in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the men who tried to sell her like a debt come due. Krebs, he said, I know the name. Man's a leech dressed up respectable. If he or your uncle come looking for you on my range, they'll find a harder door than the one I closed on you, and it won't open a crack. You don't owe me protecting, Temperance said. No, he agreed. I owe you my life, which is a debt considerably larger, and I mean to spend the rest of mine paying down the interest on it, starting with whatever's left of this one you'll let me manage on a broken leg. He held her raw, reddened hand then, careful of its rawness, and did not let go. Cyrus Bell and Sela's Krebs found their way to North Rim 3 weeks later, having tracked Temperance's trail at last through a chain of small inquiries. A hired man in Cutbank, who remembered selling a young woman fitting her description a seat on a northbound wagon. A postmaster in a town 2 counties over who recalled a letter, addressed to a Mrs. Hetty Voss, and arrived at the Poe Ranch with a paper of claim and the confident bearing of men who had never once in their lives failed to collect what they believed owed them. Temperance had known, in some quiet corner of herself, that this reckoning would come eventually, and she had spent the weeks of Ledger's recovery turning over how she meant to meet it when it did. She had decided, somewhere between splinting his leg in a blizzard and hearing Galt call her the reason his employer still drew breath, that she was no longer the girl who had crept out a kitchen door before dawn rather than face her uncle's ledger of debts. She meant to face this one standing. They found, instead of a frightened girl to reclaim, a man on a mending leg and a cane who stood in his own doorway with a stillness that unsettled Krebs before a word had passed between them, and a woman beside him who did not flinch, did not look away, and did not wait to be spoken for. Miss Calloway owes your household nothing, Ledger said, before Krebs had finished his opening claim about debts and obligations and a promise made on her behalf. Whatever her father owed you was his debt, not hers, and a man who'd marry a girl to balance a ledger instead of asking for her heart isn't owed the courtesy of an audience on my land. I'd ask you to ride on and not come back. This is a legal matter, Cyrus Bell blustered, concerning my ward. She's no ward of yours, Temperance said, stepping forward, her voice steady in a way it had not been on the porch of this same house a month before. I left your house of my own will, Uncle Cyrus, and I've built a life since that owes you no accounting. I dragged a dying man out of a blizzard with my own 2 hands 3 weeks past, and I'll tell you plainly, having done that, I've got no fear left in me for a paper claim, and a man who never once in his life risked anything for anyone but his own comfort. Ride on, as Mr. Poe says. There's nothing for you here. You'll answer for this, Krebs blustered, though the confidence had gone out of it, when I bring this before a judge who understands the value of an honest debt. Bring it, Ledger said. And bring, too, the honest accounting of a man who arranged to marry off his niece to settle a store's failed ledger, and see how kindly a judge in this territory looks on that particular arithmetic, compared to the plain fact of a woman who rode alone into a blizzard to save a stranger's life. I'll stand the cost of the finest lawyer in the territory before I'll let you walk off with a shred of claim on her, and I expect you know it, or you'd not be standing on my porch making noise instead of already in a courtroom. Whatever Krebs had come prepared to argue withered somewhat in the face of 2 people who did not move, did not waver, and plainly did not intend to be argued with, and within the half-hour, both men had ridden off toward the county seat, muttering of lawyers who would, in the end, never trouble to make the long ride back out to so thin a claim. Ledger watched them go from his porch, then turned to Temperance, who stood beside him in the pale, clean light of a winter morning gone still and mild after weeks of storm. I told you once already I owed you my life, he said. I'd like to spend it properly repaying that, if you'll have a hard, closed-off man who's learned, a good deal too late, the difference between the woman who broke him and the one who dug him out of the snow with her own 2 hands and never once asked what it would cost her to try. You're not so hard as you'd have folks believe, Temperance said. I saw what was under it the very first night, in the half-second before you shut that door. I just had to wait for the rest of you to catch up to what I'd already seen. He took her raw, work-worn hand in his, the same hand that had built a fire in a blizzard, and spliced a broken leg with strips of petticoat and stubbornness, and kissed it with a gentleness that undid her more thoroughly than the whole ride through the storm had managed. Then stay, he said, not out of debt and not out of nowhere else to go. Stay because I'm asking plain, the way I should have asked that first night instead of shutting the door. I will, Temperance said, and meant it with the whole of a heart that had walked 11 miles through a cutbank winter, and dug a man out of a North Rim blizzard to arrive, at last, somewhere that felt entirely, finally, like home. Hetty cried at the wedding that spring, unashamedly, from the front row of the small church at North Rim, and told anyone who'd listen afterward that she'd known it from the very first night, watching a half-frozen stranger stand on her doorstep with her chin still up despite everything the world had just done to her. Galt stood up beside Ledger as his best man and made, by all accounts, a genuinely terrible toast, full of references to doors and blizzards that had the whole gathered county laughing before he'd finished. Even Odalie Fenwick allowed, grudgingly, over the wedding supper, that she supposed the girl had turned out to have more grit in her than the whole county combined, and that Ledger Poe was a fool to have ever shut a door on her, and a wiser man for having finally learned better. Ledger himself, walking without his cane by then, save on the coldest mornings, took to telling the story of that first slammed door himself in later years, always ending it the same plain way. That he'd spent 2 winters keeping the world out to protect what little was left of his heart, and it had taken one impossible woman refusing to stay shut out to teach him that a door built only to keep the cold from getting in will, soon enough, keep the warm from ever getting out. He had opened his to her fully, at last, and never once regretted what he'd let inside.